Yay.
All right. Welcome, everyone. And Nina, would you like to start us off this evening?
Yeah. Yeah, welcome everyone. Thanks for being here. This is our first Zoom lecture, and we're really excited to bring the lecture series back. This is just kind of a sneak peek, and hopefully we'll continue this more next year. I am the president of the Seattle Metals Guild, and I used to run the lecture series, so this is kind of a like happy place for me. We are recording this lecture, so we will try to make it available later. None of you are being recorded because we have all of your videos off, so don't worry about that. I believe the chat is also being recorded. We will have a question and answer section at the end, so feel free to put your questions in the Q&A. You should have an option for Q&A at the bottom, and we'll get to those at the end. And then, of course, you can put in more questions at the end. And we will also have a survey for you at the end, just like going over your experience and how easy it was to access this lecture and just your thoughts for future lectures. And then if you would like to donate to this lecture, especially if you're not actually a member of the Seattle Metals Guild, we would love like a $5 or $10 donation if you feel like you want to do that, and you can. I'm going to put the link for that in the chat right now. And then I would also like to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are on today. While we meet today on our virtual platform, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the lands which we each call home, especially the Duwamish and Suquamish lands, where most of us are today. And then I would like to introduce Kristin Coomer, who's our lecture series person now. So yeah, thanks Kristin, and thanks other Kristin.
Yes, thank you, Nina. I'm really happy to be here today with you and Kristin and everyone else who's able to join us. And I'm happy to introduce Kristin to you. She received her MFA in metalsmithing from Cranbrook Academy of Art and has a BA in art history from art history and anthropology and sociology from Carleton College. She's received recognition from the Fulbright program, the American Scandinavian Foundation, Artist Trust, and Jack Straw, among others. And in 2008, she was honored as an island treasure by the Bainbridge Island and Humanities Council. Kristin's work has been featured in print, in Fiber Arts Design Book 7, Metalsmith Magazine, and can be seen in public commissions throughout the Puget Sound region. She lives and works on Bainbridge Island, which if you're joining us from farther afield, you may not know is about a half an hour from here by way of ferry. And it's just the most gorgeous place to be and a lovely place to visit. So I'd also like to let you know a little bit about today's talk before I hand it over to Kristin. Her work traverses jewelry, sculpture, and learning environments. And she had the opportunity to live for 5 months in the Slovak Republic on a Fulbright Grant, where she studied drotárstvo. She'll probably teach us how to pronounce that. It's a tradition of wire working that's recognized by UNESCO as an intangible heritage. And her experiences during this time revealed more than a catalog of traditional techniques. Today, she'll share insight into this country and culture and how itinerant tinkers of Slovakia may have implications for contemporary art, interpersonal communication, and repair so necessary in the world today. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Kristin. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. And with that introduction, beautiful introduction, thank you. It sounds like I have my work cut out for me tonight. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Is that coming through for everyone?
Yes, it's wonderful.
Okay, great. Thank you to the Seattle Metals Guild for taking a chance on me for this lecture tonight. I pestered Nina from way before I left for Slovakia. I was just so excited. I thought that it would be great to share even before I had anything to share. So really so many thanks to a great organization. Hopefully those of you in the metals world will see the pun in the title here, drawing a line. refers to the process of creating wire, as well as creating definition. So drawing, we'll talk about a little bit, and drawing a line really refers to the way that I came into this particular project, and a little bit of looking back at a life of creating, and how sometimes when you're in it, it doesn't make sense, and reflecting is really an excellent way to bring that into focus. So I wanted to talk a little bit about places of beginning, and I thought there are a number of places that I've begun and begun again. This piece was from, I would say, late 1991, when I was a student at Cranbrook Academy of Art studying with Gary Griffin. And it marked a transition or a threshold for me at that time that has had implications for really all of the work I've done, whether it's in the studio or in exchange with people, or as a creator of programs, where I found a place where there was this kind of balance or tension between material that I was interested in and the form that it took and the action that it was engaged in. It's probably apparent to you from looking at it at the screen, but it is a pear that was wrapped in just standard binding wire, the kind of wire that would be on any bench, any metals bench for holding pieces together when they're being soldered. It's an uncoated steel wire, and in the early 90s, it was really still seen as the kind of the lowest material in the spectrum of materials in the jewelry metals studio. And for that reason, I was attracted to it. It was inexpensive, accessible. It was easy to manipulate, and it had this quality for me of a fiber textile, and related really well to techniques that I was familiar with, stitching and wrapping. And so this is one beginning. This beginning morphed into another beginning. This is a piece from around 2000, 2002, that was riffing on this idea of wire, same wire, different kind of organization of the material. At this point, I was very interested in taking wire and doing the simplest possible technique and replicating that technique many multiples of times to create something complex. And so I was using a rug weaving technique called sumac, which is an ancient, really very simple but very sturdy technique that just involves, if you've ever made a god's eye, crossing two pieces and using your binding material to go in a spiral around those two pieces. And each time you cross the cross, you wrap your material around it. So very, very simple. You can see here just two cross pieces and then a spiraling wire. And so this would be kind of the second beginning. This is a beginning after I had children, when I was re-engaging with my studio practice, and I was thinking about the kind of things that I needed. I needed something that was not toxic, that didn't require a dedicated studio, that could be done at my kitchen table, that could be put away easily and brought out when my kids were napping. Things that, again, could be done. I could do the intellectual work, thinking about it, and then I could just shut that off and do kind of rote process work. So two different beginnings. But, as with anything, there are beginnings that happened well before the beginning that I'm talking about. And when I think about wire, one of the beginnings for me was a book that was given to me probably shortly after it was published by Suzanne Slazen and Daniel Rosenstroch. And it wasn't a coffee table book per se, but it was a design book in a series of design books where they went and cataloged different beautiful photographs on a central theme. So there's a Japanese design version of this same book, but this wire book, this wire everyday things book, for me was the beginning. And here we have a piece from very, very early first millennium that was found in a Hungarian trove. And I show it in part because this form, this material has been a part of this culture, whether it was politically inscribed or whether it was, a group of people who lived there and were moving around before. So the spiral, the wire, this is something that's very much a part of this Slavic area culture. And wire, this is just one iteration of how wire would have been made. Early wire would have been hammered or twisted and pulled. Here we see a draw plate, and I don't know, I thought I knew something about metalsmithing, but I did not realize that the swing is not incidental here. The swing is actually a lever, so that the work is being done by the legs rather than the arms on this. So this monk is here making a selection of wire through the draw plate. And for those of you who aren't familiar with it, you can make your own wire by pulling softened metal through successively smaller holes in what's called a draw plate, which is right here, that looks like a paddle. And this is a process that's been done for thousands of years. And here, probably from the 1300s, an illustration of that. It's still done today. A lot of the things that we would think about around this time, the Middle Ages, easy to think about chainmail. This is actually a piece from the Powązkie Museum in Žilina, where I was situated on the Fulbright. But the origin story for me also relates to this connection, as I mentioned, between textiles and wire. This kind of, at the time, I would say it was, I was looking for the space between two seemingly opposed ideas, this kind of feminine, historically feminine work, needlework, stitching, knitting, and this kind of masculine work that would have been more of a blacksmithy, like using the dirty wire. This is a really gross generalization, but at the time I was looking for something that was neither one nor the other. And Arlene Fish's book, Textile Techniques in Metal, was an entry for me into ways of looking at that. But as I mentioned, it was the Wire Everyday Things book that really started this connection for me in my mind about Slovakia. And the book itself is, you'll see a couple illustrations during the talk from the book, largely pieces that had been collected in Parisian flea markets and things that had been made really during the Industrial Revolution. However, there were some photos in the beginning of the book, this one in particular, that were from the Powązkie Museum in Žilina, which is the fourth largest city in Slovakia. And if you imagine Slovakia as kind of like an squished out hexagon, the top northern part, which is close to the Czech Republic and Poland, is a very mountainous area, and this town of Žilina is on the Slovak side of the mountains. This is a photo that I would say is very descriptive of lots of the attributes of the wire worker. And when people, so drotárstvo is the word in Slovak, and I apologize for any Slovak speakers out there for whom I'm butchering that word. It's not easy to say. It was difficult to learn how to spell for me, but the challenge in English is that there's no easily translatable word for all of the things that this career person would have done. So when I talk about wireworking, I'm really talking about one facet of what the tinkers would do. They were also repairers of pots. They would make little patches out of sheet metal and rivet them to pots. And basically, their job was to walk from town to town and repair items of value, which at that time in the non-urbanized areas of lots of Europe. I have a friend who is living and grew up in the Netherlands, and he said he remembers the tinkers coming through his little town. But they would come and repair crockery and glassware, which were expensive goods at the time. So here you can see the tinker sitting with an inverted pot, and he's got a kind of a mesh that he's starting to create around the pot, which will be there will be a ring around the base and a ring around the lip of the pot that will connect the webbing that he's going to be creating. You can see also that he's got these leather slippers that have laces that wrap around his ankles. He's got what is actually kind of a coarse fabric pair of pants and a tunic. And he's got this hat. The strap that he has on is more than likely connected to a wooden box, which was his tool kit, and almost like a shoe shine kit. And then he's got the hat. You can see he's got a very leathery complexion, and he's got a walking stick. So this guy was in this book and referred to as an archival photo from the Povazke Museum in Žilina. This is actually a photo from the museum, which I think is really interesting because it both expands on the field of what's happening in the photo, but also illuminates the fact that a lot of these traveling repair people had young apprentices, sometimes quite young, sometimes tween age, young teenagers who would accompany them. And we don't really know a lot about what they would do, but it's presumed that they were apprentices of some sort. Now, the reason that this career or this vocation grew up in this area had to do with a bunch of things happening all at once. I mentioned that it's in a mountainous region. This is not a very productive agricultural area, and during the winters and the off seasons, it was really hard for people in these communities to earn a living. And it also was a very heavily mined area for many, many years, and especially through the Industrial Revolution, continues to be a mined area. So they had a resource there. There was also this kind of, because they were a border culture, they part of Czechoslovakia originally, but this border with the mountains, now a border with the Czech Republic, there was this kind of liminal place that they inhabited. So they could cross borders more easily. Here you can see a diagram that shows a rough rendition of the technique used. Here you see two, presumably these are two apprentices. This is from a postcard. And so maybe a little bit romanticized, but you get to see a bunch of different attributes. Again, they had these kind of attributes that made them recognizable. And this is probably from a bit later. There were firsthand accounts of the appearance of these tinkers, who are sometimes loosely categorized as, there's a cultural traveler that has in the British Isles. This is somebody who would have been kind of running parallel to that. There wasn't a lot of overlap between them. So when I was thinking about going, I was really curious about what's the story with this? I knew that a lot of historical research had been done on wire working, so I wasn't presuming to go and do that research myself, but I did suspect that these ideas of itinerant work, this kind of border crossing, this it's been referred to as transnationalism, this idea of repair, making something from nothing, and the idea that somebody could kind of create, reinvent themselves and make themselves transform from someone who was struggling economically or culturally into somebody who was successful beyond their small town, but still retained connections to their small town. So I was interested in how that related to Slovak culture, and specifically how it may have related to ethnic minorities, including the Romani. And this is a side note that probably merits a whole return trip to Slovakia. This is the only photo that I have found of a Romani tinker. There's not a lot of documentation, and I suspect that there are many reasons for that. It doesn't mean that they didn't exist, but this idea that the Romani who were nomadic in some ways, were working in this kind of edge economy. There's a lot of speculation about that, but this is the only documentation that I was able to find while I was there. And this is from the Museum of Roma Culture in Brno, Czech Republic. Here you see the backpack with some of the wire, some of the things that they would have made, like a rest for an iron and a mousetrap. So early on, these, in addition to the repair of the pots, a lot of things that were constructed were not really focused on decorative elements, although there were some, these are some conventions that you'll see repeated in the more decorative work. But they were really focused on utilitarian items. So in addition to the repair, the tinkers would go and they would fabricate small scale household items. They could be cake racks or iron rests, like you see here, trivets. Once the Industrial Revolution really came roaring in, it was really easy for these products to be translated into an automated, more mass-produced genre. So here's a photo from an early French catalog showing some of the other things that would have been made. There is a toaster, several toasters. We see a bottle holder. We see in a very Catholic country, we see a real demand for funerary wreath structures, so wire forms for funerary wreaths, you see here. But in spite of the automation of industrial practices, you'd still see handwork being done to finish these pieces in shops. The shops expanded and grew and really took root in places like Poland and Russia, and with immigration to the US, found places in Pittsburgh, again, a mining area, New York, and as far west as Chicago, although we don't see a lot of large-scale tinkery or wire working on the West Coast that I'm aware of. Other products that they would make included dog muzzles, which I love, just beautiful sculptural elements. hangers, this gorgeous candle holder, which I think is a really great bridge item. It's got some of the techniques, the technical applications, these spirals that you see in previous work, but it's really kind of just a lovely decorative wall sconce. The thing that also drew me to this work was the fact that I had been influenced by a number of artists, including Alexander Calder, who adopted a lot of these kinds of ideas about wire working that seemed to be cropping up in my studies. So this kind of repetition of form, the spiral, wire, just there's something about it that wants to be bent in a circle, a loop, a spiral. The idea of reclaiming cast-off materials, the idea of making something that kind of transcends its source, and here starting to think about jewelry, which we'll come back to as well. So this is the castle at Budatin, which is the site of the Povazke Museum. It's the only castle in town in Žilina, but there are numerous castles outside of town. And they have the reason I was based in this part of Slovakia is for this dedicated exhibition of wire working in a standalone hall at the museum. And this is again another talk which would be taking you through all of the exhibitions, all the text panels in this space, which were carefully constructed and written to really try to illustrate the significance of wire working in Slovakia. So we mentioned that it started as a repair technique. It migrated its way through the Industrial Revolution. These are some of the other things that were being constructed. These reinforced decorative dishes, picture frames. And as time went on, things got more and more ornate and were kind of like a flex for showing off skills. These are intricately woven, plated and twisted wire vessels and boxes. And but through everything, you see these conceits of spirals, of loops, of extended loops, and of stitching. I wish that we had a speak back function on the chat here, but I will just divulge. These are leg and arm braces. So again, back and forth between the highly decorative, the highly practical, and always really thinking about the structure and the space that is both occupied by and voided by these elements. So in the course of history, the wire was significant, and then it became illegal to practice. During the socialist regime, it was not legal for people to have home businesses. And so the tradition of tinkering and the idea that you would pass this down to anybody in your family was almost obliterated up until the early 40s, after the end of the war, when there was a concerted effort by a small group of people to reclaim the technique and to really bring it back full force. What happened was an exhibition that was at the Povazke Museum that featured works made entirely out of wire and then I guess some mixed media that were representational of traditional folk tales. So you have the princess, you have all different, you have a dragon in a lair, you have a wanderer, you have this child who may be an apprentice to a wire worker, you have animals, you have an owl. And this little vignette, this little space is set up in the museum as a a refresher on that exhibit. So there was an intentional push to bring this technique back. People had held on to some elements of it, and so there were a few initiators of the work that came back. What you'll see from that time, from the time in the 40s through present day, is that there's this kind of back and forth between techniques that were original techniques for repair. This is a contemporary piece that's very reminiscent of that historic piece. And you'll see references to historic techniques, sometimes with the incorporation of new materials, and sometimes with experimentation of form. This is an unfinished piece of jewelry by an unnamed maker. But what you see a lot with this resurrection of the process is a reference to traditional techniques, a reference to the way things were done. What I want to take, I want to take a little diversion right now and talk about people, a group of artists who took this idea of jewelry and wire and really brought the tradition of drotárstvo as a repair technique into another realm of wearable art. Remígia Biskupska was an artist who had spent a lot of time in Žilina, in this town where I was based, and was self-taught. She unabashedly borrowed from some of the imagery and techniques of the before times, but applied them in ways that were really fashion forward for their time, really looking at the organic world, at not just the wire as a standalone element, but using it as a support or a feature for other media. One of the things that makes this tradition so unique is that it's cold connected. There was a little bit of soldering at times with the repair, but really to be considered traditional drotárstvo, you are just using cold connections. So here's this artist who's relatively self-taught, using these techniques and borrowing heavily from jewelry, borrowing from contemporary fashion of the 60s and early 70s, and yet she's still calling back to these techniques or the imagery that she saw in traditional works, such as the spiral and the chain. This imagery, again, was springboarded off of by Blanka Šperková, who, again, I've indicated here the country that she's from. She's actually from Slovakia, which was part of Czechoslovakia, and now lives in Brno, which is a university town about an hour north of Bratislava. She is an artist who was really less influenced by the craft of the artwork, craft of wire work, and more influenced by her contemporaries who were working in art forms and performance and social disruption. So you'll see with a lot of her work that is, I'll just say as an aside, she hand knits these without knitting needles. They are all done in a knitted form, but they are not done with needles. I do not know how she does it, but all of a piece. She's not using the wire, the kind of cross pieces and the spiral so much, but she is taking the material and she's expanding it into a really solidly foundational jewelry gesture, a jewelry statement, and still really dedicating herself to wire. I really enjoyed some of the work that she created where she had as her inspiration the fine art and then extracted certain pieces from that to make her jewelry. So this is jewelry about jewelry. Her current work is a collaboration with her grandchildren, in which the grandchildren create artwork and she is rendering them with, kind of shocking similitude out of wire. So the top piece is entirely knit out of wire. But again, her grounding is less in the craft world and more in a reference to art. And humor. I'm sorry that I don't have a picture of it was a very hard to photograph piece called The Politician. She had a male politician and a female politician, and they're kind of the same genre as this piece, which I think is hilarious. Very, very political. And another artist, the last of these contemporary jewelry artist is Zuzana Gross-Rudowska, who is also really rooted in contemporary art, and less in a particular rigor about technique and more connected to an image or a concept. And this is a piece. These are pieces that were installed at the Alliance Française in Bratislava, and each one of them had a custom-made pedestal that was lit from underneath, and the space inside had vaulted ceilings. So all of the work was lit and cast shadows that created a really beautiful reference up on the ceiling. Again, thinking about the body, thinking about line, and how the structure of wire is really incidental to the bigger idea that she's working on there. The wire serves a more of a background purpose, even though it is a design element. This is a bracelet photographed in context. So the idea that contemporary artists are thinking about wire is something that we are really familiar with. I mean, I showed the Calder piece, Ruth Asawa, Arlene Fish. There are a lot of people in the narrative that I inherited in jewelry metals that are not from the Slavic countries who are working in that way. But I think that there's something unique to the qualities of wire, the way that wire shows up in ways that are outside of art or craft tradition. So I want to show a little bit about what I was looking at while I was in Slovakia, and thinking about these things that are incidental, things that may be overlooked on a daily basis, that might have reference to the qualities that I really saw coming to the surface in learning about wire. So I will say line, shadow, the volume held by or inscribed by line. The idea of making something from nothing. These gates are found all over Slovakia, all over Eastern Europe. They are created from the cutout blanks, the cutout refuse areas of multiple manufactured items. So you can see the two strips there that are cut parts, and these are just the background. So I can't tell you the number of times I've had a sheet of something cut, water jet cut, and people have said, oh, you should make something from that. But people did and do there. Really foundational to what I'm thinking about right now is this idea of repair, which I really loved seeing the ways that people were choosing to repair in a very functional way. Different objects, gates. This is repair on a castle, scaffolding, not made of wire per se, but definitely, in my mind, referential. I looked at people and the way that they were moving. I mean, I came to Slovakia and I didn't speak the language well, and I still don't speak it well. I knew a little bit, enough to find my way onto the train. I knew some greetings. I knew basic things. So a lot of my world was very grounded in observation and really trying to read things and anticipate responses. So I was deeply steeped in communicating or observing people in a non-language way. Thinking about the ways that bodies occupy space. This was Maria Bartusova, who's an artist who I did not know about before I was in Slovakia, but also was very influential to me in her work with visually impaired students. And here you can see them with some of her artwork, which was made largely from cast plaster in balloons and condoms, and then some pieces that were cast subsequently in bronze. And this idea of not being able to speak a language, being restricted with your senses, and then having this expansion of the senses was really poignant to me. It's, the ways that bodies move in space are also came to the surface in my relationship with the Nova Synagoga and the cultural centers in Žilina. This is a performance by a dance troupe from Bratislava who is comprised, or that was comprised entirely of dancers over 50 years old. And this idea of the line, they had strung linear elements, yarn throughout the performance space, the idea of the body, and we have a lot of constraints placed on our bodies. We have assumptions made about what aging bodies can do. This became another part of this linear, this narrative dance connecting. This is a video still. And the ways that people interpret their surroundings. I'm not sure if this reads very well, but it is the work of a graphic designer, Svetlar Midlo, and I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that as well. This reminds me a great deal of the attributes of the wire worker and this kind of graphic rendition of line that would remind me of wire. So the ways that people are looking at their own cultures and interpreting, that turned from looking at books, doing research at the library, reading design books, to really, again, walking. I walked miles and miles and miles in the city and in the hills. This is another attribute of the wire worker, is that traveling, that movement and exploration. And so being on the street in Bratislava, seeing artwork, being on the street and seeing astounding renditions of text that was really illegible to me, but I'm sure could be read. The idea that I couldn't understand it, but I could still appreciate it, became, you know, I was looking for clues, looking for signs all the time. And I was looking for really elemental signs. And this piece in particular, which is was on the walk between my house and the museum, the Považské Museum, made me remember the exercises that I used to do when we were learning how to write cursive. And this O has always been an intriguing form for me. So I started, you know, where do you start? I knew that I had some work that I needed to make, but I didn't really know where to start. I didn't want to just recreate the things that I had seen in the museum. I'm familiar with those techniques and I've embodied them. And I really, there was something else that I needed to say. And as I was in my studio, which was an office in the humanities department at the university, I started letting my arm and my hand move in ways that felt like they were the ways that wire wanted to move. And this kind of alphabet started appearing, and I'm really thinking about, again, what it means to be understood. And it dawned on me that jewelry and language occupy a really similar social space and a similar physical space. They're an in-between, they're a communicator or a placeholder for us. And I started thinking about how, how can I shorten the distance between those two things, between jewelry and language? And so I made what is a really clumsy sketch, this cursive letter O, out of wire. And I'll just say, not all binding wire is created equal. I did go to the industrial wire store. They thought I was insane for carrying what I think amounted to about 50 pounds of coiled wire with me across town to my studio. But there's something about the way that the structure of this wire is that it doesn't bend gracefully, it bends at an angle. So I really fought the material for a while here. But I came up with something that started to speak to this idea of intermediary, or this kind of place that I was inhabiting, the things that I was seeing that were between me and understanding a culture. And rendering it in wire was really meaningful. So the work evolved. The work is evolving. I intentionally did not show a lot of the work here that I made, because a lot of it was really, like I said, clumsy. A lot of it was very experimental, and it was really for me. It was really for me to kind of prove a concept that I could translate my technique into a new setting, that I could think outside the things that I had started doing years ago, which, those things, they need to move and change. I remember a time that I made some of those little, the piece that I showed at the beginning with the little cross pieces, the little sumac elements. I had made some jewelry out of that, and I started seeing other people using that same technique and making similar things out of wire. And I thought, this is an invitation for me to keep pushing outside of what I've done. And so I will say that in the spirit of movement, in the spirit of questioning your expectations, of going to another culture and bringing something back, of also trying to challenge yourself to think new ways as a middle-aged artist, or as an artist who has deferred their work for the sake of making a living in other ways. I think that the work is really ripe for me to jump into a future where I am feeling energized again. I'm feeling like there's a beginning to this story that I haven't concluded, and like there's room to actually communicate. There's room to communicate with my art, just as there's room to expand communication around language. And hopefully those things synthesize as I move into the future. There's writing to be done. I'm really excited about some of the book research that I was able to do while I was not able to make things. There are books that are in Slovak or in Czech that I took photographs of that I'll work on translating. And they reveal additional information about techniques or about ideas that I haven't even touched on yet. So this is the last slide, and yet it's another beginning. And I just want to say again, thank you to everybody who attended tonight, and I'm happy to indulge you with some Q&A or whatever seems logical to come next. And I will say, I think I mentioned to some of you that this slideshow or this presentation is not going to be the same as the one that I'll be doing here at the Bainbridge Island Museum of Art in January, which will be more travelogue, more about surroundings and the influence of the country and what I was looking at in a broader scale. So you won't be browbeaten if you decide to come to that on January 18th.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much, Kristin. I feel like I learned so much about the history and the evolution and the interpretations of wire art.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Now I would like to open it up to questions from the audience. So yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to put it in the chat or the Q&A, and we will get to that. My question was going to be, what's next? Like, are you writing a book, or are you just doing research?
There is a book in the future, and it's been a whirlwind since I got back, and making some big life transitions right now. So I'm hoping that there will be room in my brain and my work day to start collating images and organizing that. I think what's interesting to me right now is how expansive and how necessary this idea of repair is, and how a lot of people are thinking about that in terms of, climate and culture. And, I can't even begin, we all know it's staggering how much needs to happen. But this idea that there's a structure that exists, and what I didn't get into is that there's also this whole nationalist idea when you're really adhering to a tradition. I think that there's an invitation for, this is the way we've always done it. This is the way it's always going to be. And that also can validate political beliefs in other realms. So I do think that this idea of art being a stand-in or a representation for political beliefs or change making is really appealing. So the book will have something to do with that.
Wonderful. I've got a question for you. Were you able to find others who were contemporarily using the same process, or did you find that it was really more of an historic thing when you landed there?
So the artist, Remigia Biskupska was obviously predated, but the Blanka Šperková is still living and working avidly in the Czech Republic, and Zuzana Raus-Grudowska is also working. Obviously, she had a show right when I arrived there. So there are these artists who are working very specifically in that genre. There's a really rich jewelry metals department at the Art and Design Academy in Bratislava, and it's called Small, Medium, Large. They do installation work as well as small wearable pieces, and it's led by a very interesting Czech artist. And so I would say that there are artists who are using using the idea of wire and kind of riffing very tangentially, but and then the other thing is that there's a school, like a folk school called Uluv, that is dedicated to teaching traditional techniques. And also each year they have a competition called Rings in Water, where they have contemporary designers and craftspeople who are drawing very literally from those historic traditions of textile, like lace making and woodworking and wire working, but they're competing in this design realm for objects that can be made in contemporary life that have relevance to us today. So there are different ways of these things coming into practice. And I think I saw not in Slovakia, but of Slovak descent. I think I saw one of the people online is working at a similar folk school in Portland, teaching this technique, and he is, as I said, of Slovak descent and has spent time there. It's an interesting path because some of the ways that these ideas come together are in technical universities rather than in fine art universities, which are largely steeped in the academic tradition. And so it's more about keeping your feelers out and your eyes open to different ways that people are working. It's not like there's one pathway.
Yeah, and that's really interesting because the historic work that you showed clearly had a functional purpose, reason why it was being created, but it was just so decorative and full of character at the same time. Just a really lovely combination that lends itself to so many applications, like you're saying. Hey, we've got a question from Kath. She says she wonders about the role of labor in this, and that so many of your pieces involve repetitive forms that are extremely time consuming to create. So when you were speaking about the tinkers wandering from repair to repair, she wondered if there was a connection for you there.
Yeah, I mean, I think it has to do with the body. I think that labor for me is a real, translates very literally to emotion. And, you know, I'm one of those people who has to clean the kitchen when I'm upset. But I think that the idea of labor, I'm extremely fortunate, right? This is a labor, I can examine labor and I can utilize labor as a talking point, as an activity. I'm not obliged to it like the tinkers would have been. That labor was partly because that's the way that went, right? They were not wealthy people. So I think there's a difference between labor that is a requirement and labor that is done to examine the idea of work. And but I do think that I value things that have an investment of time and care, and labor is one way that I demonstrate that in my work. So I do think that exists. There's a lot of pride in when you this UNESCO Intangible Heritage designation was partly validated by many letters of testimonial from people who were either members of community craft organizations, kind of stitch and bitch organizations that would get together and do that, or practice. Some of the artists I showed would have written letters of testimonial for the worth of that technique and the validation. So there's a lot of pride in the fact that it is done by hand and that it is something that has been carried from generation to generation.
I just shared a link to some information about the UNESCO intangible intangible cultural heritage. I hadn't heard of that before, and you introduced me to that. So they have a really interesting site where you can navigate through connections between different practices and cultures and countries. That's really fascinating. I've got a question for you about your Fulbright Fellowship. How did you approach that? Was it something that you'd known someone else to have done, or were you specifically interested in Slovakia when you approached this project?
So I actually had a Fulbright in 1992 and 3 to Iceland right out of graduate school. And so I applied when I was in grad school and spent the following year after graduate school there. And the thing that was great for me was that it required me to formulate my ideas in terms of a proposal that becomes your reference point. And I did use my proposal when I went to Slovakia. I would go back and check and make sure that I was, oh yeah, that I actually meant that when I wrote it. That is coming to the surface. The coming back as an adult in my 50s, I knew for years that I wanted to, I mean, really for like 30 years that I wanted to go to Slovakia, and tried many times to make contact with the museum. I didn't write my emails in Slovak. It was really a hazard. It's not comfortable for people who don't speak English fluently to try to use that in emails, for example. So I was thwarted many times over. And then I thought, I don't even know if I can do this. It's just a total gamble. And I went ahead and found out that the Intangible Heritage designation had happened a couple of years earlier. It just felt like a really lovely confluence. And then the Slovak Fulbright office was helpful in matching me up with an academic institution. So for anybody who's interested in applying for a Fulbright, the deadline's in September, and it really benefits you to have a contact in the country where you're planning to go who writes a letter of invitation from a university or an NGO. And there's a ton of information on the Fulbright website, but
I was researching this recently after being introduced to your experience, and saw that the Society of North American Goldsmiths also hosted a talk a couple of years ago with Nicole Jacquard on their YouTube channel, and she sort of demystifies the process of applying, and I found that to be pretty interesting. I'm not sure how relevant it is 3 years later, but I presume a lot of it remains relevant. So I've just shared a link to that in the chat.
Did you have any personal collections in Slovakia, or was it just of interest? Did you have anyone to reach out to, or were you just cold calling?
So here's a funny story. I wrote a little piece about Mickey Lippy for her solo show here at BIMA, and in the course of doing that, called Sharon Cranston, and happened to just be in conversation with him about going to Slovakia, and he gave me the name of Jana Makatova and Peter Makata, and they became friends. So that was one. It turns out that my neighbor across the street, who's married to a childhood friend of mine, is from the town where I was based, and I knew he was Slovak, but I didn't know he was from Žilina. So there were these funny little threads, and I got really, really lucky because I had to find my own lodging, and I looked on Airbnb, and it was not cheap to find a place there. And there was this one place that was a basement apartment, and it just looked really cheery and, kind of funky, not like IKEA. And the person who I ended up renting from the entire time I was there in this apartment lived above in the house above, and he was the founder and director of the cultural center, where I ended up spending a lot of time outside of the university. The university where I was based, like I said, didn't have an art program. I was a lot of an outlier there. There were some lovely people, but I was not part of their network. So I spent a lot of time with folks at the cultural center. And so there were these connections that grew up organically and have just been very important. And I would just say too, to the Fulbright, if anybody's considering going between 3 months and 5 months, I strongly recommend the 5-month option if you can at all do it, because what that afforded me was the opportunity to introduce myself and show up and really say, I'm actually here. I mean, I'm curious about what you're doing. And then it allowed me to come back again and underscore that, meet up, take the train to Bratislava and meet up with somebody again, and showing up repeatedly and showing that you are actively interested in what someone is working on is, I mean, as we all know, it's golden. And so that was very meaningful and helped me make those connections in spite of my language disability.
That's
So,
really interesting to learn, because I also heard that you needed to be fluent in order to participate in a number of Fulbright programs.
yeah,
So it's interesting to learn that that's not always the case. Yeah.
they're clear about it on the application. And I saw one of my co-Fulbrighters was on the meeting today. So
Wonderful.
yeah,
Awesome.
that's the other bonus, is that you connections that you make in that country are very are long lasting.
I imagine. Well, thank you so much. I also wanted to ask you to tell us about your upcoming events that you're hosting. I know that those are probably really relevant to some of our participants today. I've shared in the chat a little bit about, I think maybe it's an Instagram link to the Bainbridge Island Museum. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about your activities there.
Sure. So we have a series happening in January and early February called Untold Stories, and this go around, the theme is journeys. We're featuring Ariane True, who is the Washington State Poet Laureate, for our second one, but I will be, January 18th, Thursday evening, and the museum is within walking distance of the ferry. If you're coming over on the ferry, it's easy walk up the hill.
Yep.
And this will be more of a reflection of the movement around the country, and kind of talking about maybe the flip side of what I talked about today. So that's on Thursday the 18th. And then there is a very, very, very introductory workshop, 3 hours long, which will basically give people a little sampling of just working with the material, and then talking a lot about technique and talking about some of the research that I have started. So
Great. Well,
yeah.
really beautiful. And thank you so much for sharing. What a rich, amazing experience you've had. And so cool to learn more about it. Thank you.
Well, thank you all.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, for anyone who's still here, we also have one more thing to ask of you. If you'd be willing to fill out our survey, I think you might also get a link to it when our talk concludes. But we're looking for feedback on the series for the lectures in 2024. This has been so wonderful. Thank you so much to everyone for showing up and being here and being part of this. We look forward to seeing you at the series in the new year, if not at our members holiday party in December.
Yeah.
Well, thanks to everybody who showed up. Great to see you out there in the ether. And yeah, thanks again to Seattle Metals Guild for doing just such quality work. I'm so proud to be a part of the people who do that, kind of have that attention to detail. So thank you.
Well, one of the downsides of meeting online like this is that we're not able to have to share a drink together, or have some side conversations as part of this activity. So perhaps we'll have some other events in the new year that are in person, and that's some of the things that we'll ask in our survey for you to help us decide. So
yeah, save up your questions for when we're in the real room together.
I would also just like to invite everyone to the holiday party on December 10th. And if you're a member, you'll get an email with more details about that. But I'm looking forward to seeing a bunch of you in person soon.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Nina. Thanks, Kristin.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.